Well, it's time for us to get into this conversation, really focusing on the 16% tax on fuel. And in studio, I have Daniel Mainye, who is the Business Development Manager at Saiton Investments. And you also have lawyer Stephen Mogaka, who is also a finance and law expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you.
Obviously, this thing has caused what you would call consternation. But I would begin from you, Daniel, from where you sit. Was this justified?
Now, I think first of all, we need to applaud the government because they're really looking for ways in terms of reducing our debt. As you can see, the visit by IMF already triggered a conversation around we seriously need to reduce our debt portfolio, which stands at around 55.6%. Now, in terms of is it justified, I think it's a question of yes or no. Because on one side, government needs to reduce the debt. On the other side is, can we look at this thing holistically and not just one piecemeal side, which is increased taxes on this side? Because if you read the finance bill, which is of course waiting for the president to come back and look at, there's a lot of other avenues proposed where we can look at increasing our revenue. So it's a question of a holistic perspective as far as revenue collection is concerned, so that we are also not transferring a lot of this cost towards the common mwananchi, because now, as you can see, Matatu prices are being hiked, of course, already now at 25%. Today, if you came from GPO to Valley Road, where Saiton is, the cost has already been hiked by around 25%, and yet it's just 16% VAT that has been added on top. So you can already see a ripple effect going to be there in the economy. So the question is, can we ideally relook at all this from a holistic perspective and see what are those key drivers that can really help us increase revenue without necessarily then pushing that cost towards the Wanjiku?
Obviously, Wakili, from where you sit again and looking at it, because Daniel says we look at it from a holistic point of view, but unfortunately it looks like the government has hit where it hurts the most. And that is where you increase 16%, on fuel, and that generally what it does is to increase the cost of almost every other product in Kenya.
Thank you. I think, to be fair to government, this increase did not come yesterday.
Yes.
This increase is anchored in a Finance Act of 2013, 5 years down. Somebody must have slept on their job by not signaling the public and the government on the consequences of bringing into force this particular provision of the Finance Act, which has been suspended not once but twice. So I think, if you asked me, the country did not have a choice. We passed a law that required us to put 16% VAT on tax. The question we are dealing with now is whether or not it is palatable to put this provision of the Finance Act to force at this particular time. If you ask me, yes, it is not, rather no, it's not palatable, but do we have a choice? Yeah, the choice is we either get support from external debt or enhance domestic borrowing because obligations that we committed to way back 2013 and the provision of the manner in which taxes were to be raised in this country, we were all aware of this. And it's only that everybody, Kenyans' memories, we are usually very short in our memories. And perhaps this is why we are caught off guard and flat-footed when this particular law is coming into force.
All right. You appear to be talking about, a holistic approach to it and the government's part on this. But then it was delayed for about 3 years back in 2016. And then that is in 2013 for 3 years. Then 2016 was delayed for another 2 years. It was expiring on the 30th of August. But the fact that it was in the pipeline from 2013 doesn't show that the government was really keen on taxing fuel.
But Jacob, look at it from this other side, because what's causing our debts to continue growing is because we are borrowing. We're borrowing more every other time. We're bringing more money. But then look at it on this other side. We have different avenues of increasing revenue, which we've not yet explored. So let's take an example of agriculture. We are a country that prides in agriculture, whether it is tea, coffee, etc. We pride in that. but how much of this aspect do we even export? Yeah. So is it a question of, can we start supporting the Big Four agenda, which means manufacturing? Can we get more exports out of the country? Because that increases our revenue. So how can we support the manufacturing?
But the government says that part of this money they're taxing is to actually fund the Big Four agenda.
But that's the question, because you see, for example, if if you read the finance bill, one of it is actually, let's reduce the electricity cost. Because as a result of reducing electricity cost, it means manufacturing guys can now do what? Tap into that to increase their production. If they increase their production in that particular mindset, we are going to have more of that product actually getting itself out of the country. Yeah. Now, is it something that can be done? I think it can be done. Does it mean we need then to put all that pressure into one avenue? Yeah, which gives a very big ripple effect in the economy. I think that's why I'm talking about. I think we need to relook at it from an holistic perspective and not just looking at one aspect of it, which has a bigger ripple effect onto the economy.
All right. Wakili, I'm trying to imagine a situation where, because the person who is living on 200 shillings per day, and now kerosene costing 94 shillings, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
If they have to budget for that money to buy kerosene and buy food, did the government, or does the government factor the people who are living below the poverty line when it comes up with policies such as this?
Certainly they do, because each time a budget is read, I see our elected leaders applauding the minister for reading a poor budget. But this particular one is hitting everybody, particularly the most vulnerable people below the belt. Because what are we talking about? The moment you touch the energy cost, and it should be called energy cost, is not fuel, because this fuel is used to drive, to generate certain power stations, and the fuel levy is eventually reflected in the bills that we consume. It touches on the entire manufacturing cost. It touches on the transportation cost. It actually creates a spiral effect of increasing prices of virtually everything. And that is why to talk about its effect on the ordinary citizen, it literally drives people from below the poverty line to below the death line, because, they can't simply survive. We are going to have people walking to work, crime rate is going to increase, rents are not going to be paid, bills, we were priding of connectivity of electricity in the entire country. Who is going to afford it? So really, the timing is wrong. And while this act was passed in 2013, I think government, like Dan is saying, should come out with more ingenious and really poor budget proposals. And yes, the president had better take the next flight to come back and put his signature on the finance bill to suspend these things.
Very interesting. But then again, I'm just looking at our debt level.
Yes.
5 trillion. Last week, the president signed a 300 billion loan for the construction of an expressway from Nairobi to Mombasa. Yes. And then you also have another 380 billion that is going to sign in China for the construction of a second phase of a standard gauge railway. Yes. Isn't it time to stop borrowing and perhaps stop taxing people in this way?
And I agree, Jacob. Ideally, that's where we need to agree and stop a lot of borrowing and start looking inwardly into the country and seeing ways that we can develop our own capacities to be able to generate revenue on our own. Now, we've talked about things like the informal sector that forms around 60%. If you look at the finance bill, it talks about, let's see ways of generating revenue from the informal sector, which already constitutes 60% of the economy. Now, look at the other side. We've talked about exports. Can we create a more export-driven sort of country where we get more the manufacturing industry up and running and increase our exports? Can we also look at sources like, instead of government focusing on developing these projects alone, can we see more private sector partnerships with government so that private sector can also take a bit of that hit to be able to develop these turnkey projects. So if you get a company that is focusing on construction, can government sign a PPP? Because most of these guys can also access funds from outside, not necessarily government borrowing, and be able to do that development. So there are avenues that I think the government already can explore easily without, again, as I said, focusing on one particular part, which has a larger impact on your economy.
Let me throw this to you because as a follow-up question still on the same.
Yes.
And as regards the borrowing to construct, a 6-lane expressway, doesn't it defeat the common sense of constructing the standard gauge railway?
I think...
Is it economically viable to you from where you sit?
From where I sit, as I said, as in you have to look at it from two different perspectives. Because, of course, if I look at it from that narrow perspective, for sure, it doesn't make sense. Now, we are in that peculiar situation where we really need to finish these developments that you're talking about because they open ways for further development into the country, which either investors, if it is road infrastructure, it means we can move goods from point A to point B very fast. If you look at transport of, agricultural products, manufacturing products, it becomes much easier to do. Now, is it feasible to keep borrowing every time to do these things? I don't think it's the best way to actually finance a lot of development. And that's why we are talking about explore things like private partnerships, because that opens avenues for you to reduce your borrowing so that the private sector partners can also play a big role in this development.
All right.
Yes.
A 3 trillion budget, Wakili, that will most likely have a 20 billion shillings deficit in that matter.
Sure.
But in a country where you have members of parliament earning money and not being taxed, and where expanding the tax, bracket has never, been followed up thoroughly, it is hard to convince Kenyans that 16% VAT on fuel is what is the most probable cause, for this.
It may be difficult, but sitting where Nyaure is sitting at KRA and CS Rotich is sitting in Treasury, the approach to collecting revenue easy is to introduce a revenue that has a wide base and which is easy to collect. So in terms of the ease to collect and coverage, I think the VAT solves their problem because you pay it at the pump. All petroleum dealers are made tax agents, so it is easy. And they started collecting money yesterday very easily. But whether, as you say, that is the best route. To be the devil's advocate, I think the people who are employed in this country have for a long time suffered a very heavy tax burden when the business people do not. So if MPs are exempt from taxes, they are part of those people in employment who, through pay-as-you-earn taxes, are really overburdened. And in a country where we are suffering a serious budget deficit, in a country where we are now defaulting on even paying employees, government employees, their salaries. So you can quite start getting worried that our current expenditure, our current budget is beyond our means. We cannot even service our current budget. And therefore, I think in the wisdom of those who are designing the best tax to get out of this quagmire, they chose that is the route to go. And it is like there was a conspiracy that there was no notice to the public or to anybody until 31st of August. And suddenly there is a circular that there is a tax that has come into force. Where was our budget committee of parliament? What was parliament passing when they were passing a budget the other day?
Very interesting question.
Until an amendment is pushed through too late in the day. People need to be serious when they are dealing with public affairs of this country.
And we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, because the International Monetary Fund was all over trying to push us to review the interest caps.
Yes.
When you look at this VAT, do you see their hand alongside the World Bank?
You see, IMF and World Bank ideally serve different purposes.
Obviously.
World Bank will come and finance your projects. IMF don't finance projects. Then they come and, try and look at, your debt portfolio and whether it's going out of hand and how can they sort of help you to cushion yourself from external shocks. So if you look at, of course, our debt portfolio right now is at 56.5%. That is 6.5% above the rate that is set by IMF or any other country.
Yeah.
So IMF, the pressure is not actually from IMF, and neither are they saying go and revise your interest rate caps and whatever. Then they're telling you you are at a bad state. You need to start thinking about your debt portfolio and see ways of starting to generate more revenue internally without always trying to borrow. Of course, they'll come in and help you, but as a government, as a country, I think we now need to start putting in ways.
So you don't see a possibility of a push in this thing?
I don't see a possibility of that, because you see, for them, it's to come and warn you and tell you, by there, guys, you've reached a rate where things are not going to go.
I don't agree with that.
Yes.
Because IMF, yes, must have a hand and are pushing. Why are they pushing? Any financier will look at your financial estimates, and in this case, we presented our 2013 budget to them, and the Finance Act clearly and expressly provides for the tax. And then here we are going, asking for support from them, and they are saying, you promised that you indicated you were collecting this tax since 2013. Why have you not collected it? So, I mean, they are rightly entitled to pushing you and saying, we relied upon your budget estimate and Finance Act to make these commitments. Yeah. You have not implemented it. Can you go back and implement it?
Absolutely.
But
well,
just to, because you see, Wakili, it's good, yeah. They'll set pressure on you, but I don't think they'll come and tell you, go and increase your interest rate cap or change this and that. They'll expect you to do something about it for sure.
But if you had a proposal on the same
you
delayed it, then they will push you towards the implementation.
They will push it, and they're rightly entitled to do that. I have been a financier and a banker, and I know that for certain. You will do it. Any financier will do that.
Absolutely. Let's get to the politics of it, because you double also as a political analyst. It has escalated now to the fact that the cabinet secretary is likely to face impeachment, and there's the public litigator Okiya Omtata in court as well as court. Where do you see this go after tomorrow?
No, this one is going nowhere because I think the politics is the mere drama that seeks to divert people's attention. Yeah, because look, Okiya Omtata, and I wish him a lot of luck in his endeavors. A judge dealing with that matter will be at a quagmire. We saw the Chief Justice the other day, complaining he has been underfunded in the budget, so because of lack of revenue. So how does a judge sitting starved of budget money and tell Omtata this is the only source of the government revenue? How do you stay implementation of that law, and all government operations are soon winding to a halt? Is a tricky one. About impeachment, and I think our politicians need to be honest about this. Rotich cannot implement a law that does not exist. This law was passed in 2013, assented to, and it has been suspended twice. The suspension has expired, and Rotich is implementing. How do you then start baying for his blood? Does he have responsibility?
Because you're saying there was... Obviously, the amendment has not been sent to by the president.
Yeah, he has a law that he has to implement, and therefore this is the dishonesty from our political class that we must, shun at the earliest opportunity. I should have expected that the Budget Committee should have made this amendment long ago, or a special request or a motion to further suspend the implementation of this particular law. But they did not. They are only waking up too late in the day when it has kicked in. And remember, even now courts faced with this situation, the law is already in force. Yeah. It is already being implemented. What do you stop? Yeah? What do you stop? If anybody had gone there ahead of 31st of August, then you would have suspended the implementation or the commencement of that particular law. What do you expect courts to do at this point in time?
But interesting. Obviously, now it looks like our hopes are really anchored on President Uhuru Kenyatta. He's the only person who can save this. But as we wind up, the problem of overrepresentation and cutting down on wastage and corruption. Could it be a solution to this overtaxation if we were to end the issue of overrepresentation?
For sure, for sure. I think if you look at the current trend with our officials being arrested left, right, and center, there's already a message going out that enough is enough. We have a very big debt portfolio. We can't afford to be losing money into corruption and things that don't make sense. Yeah. So there's a clear message going out, and we hope that this fight does not stop, that it continues to the very end, and ensure that we are able to now start, bringing back these resources, because for sure they're going to help address the issue of debt, because debt, as you can see, it's increasing because some money is going into things that are not supposed to go to.
Or because we were paying 342 MPs, I don't know, 67 senators, 47 governors, and I don't know, 1,000 plus MCAs.
You see.
It's also a question.
Yep.
Wakili, as we wind up, there's this general feeling amongst Kenyans that the handshake is what has brought all this, because yesterday we saw the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga saying that the president will come and he will assent to the Finance Bill 2018. We know, were it not for the handshake, probably Raila would be leading his troops in opposing this particular. So would you say the handshake has really, negated the welfare of Kenyans when it comes to advocating for their rights?
True. This is the flip side of, the tragedy about the handshake, that in the absence of an official opposition in this country, the checks and balances you would have expected on government and the executive are not there. And we would have been a lot happier if the Right Honorable Raila was leading his troops in and even street demos to make sure that this law does not come into force. But here we are. But all said and done, it is interesting that the Right Honorable knows that the President will come back, and for sure he will assent to that bill. We hope he does. But before we leave this, and this is really the reason why the citizens are extremely impatient with this law. We expected that the fruits of the anti-corruption war would now be starting to trickle down. And in particular, when the Prime Minister of the UK came in and signed a legal framework to repatriate proceeds of corruption that are stashed in foreign banks, one really would have expected that by this time, Kenyans should be treated to a tax holiday rather than an additional tax. This is really not fair, and that is why I think the President had better take a faster flight to solve this emerging crisis.
Tax holiday. The President is in Beijing. Maybe the next one day or so, the President will be expected back in the country. And now it appears like the hopes are really anchored in the hands of the President as we wait for him to make a decision. In the meantime, it looks like it's an executive legislature full-blown war as MPs bay for the blood of the Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich. We'll be following up these details for you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us tonight. And you're very much appreciated for your views and your contribution to this program. O'Brien Kimani is up next with business.